Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Mollishri Vyas, Professor in the Center for Community Organization and Development Practice in the School of Social Work at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. This module is on the 8 model framework of Weil and Gamble, which is part of the course on community organization for the subject social work education. The module will help you to learn about critical lens for community practice in the 21st century and the 8 model framework and its details. It will also help you to learn about the relevance of this framework for community practitioners. The 8 model framework was derived from the work of various scholars of community practice. It incorporates 3 critical lenses which essentially influence the community macro practice in the 21st century. And the 4 major concepts of community organization, such as development, organizing, planning and change, are also highlighted through this model framework. Murray Ross, one of the early scholars was one of the early scholars to introduce various models of practice and philosophies to guide the community practice to achieve outcomes are basically reform orientation, a planning orientation and process orientation. Essentially is talking about the backdrop of community practice and the fact that one may seek to bring about social change, to reform communities, to change behaviors, ways of thinking, ways of approaching issues. One may approach community organization also with a planning orientation where one is seeking to match needs and resources for addressing the issues and concerns of the community, and a process orientation where essentially one is seeking to bring about some kind of a positive change in the abilities, in the confidence level and the readiness of people to act on their own behalf. So these are the 3 orientations that one largely finds in community work. These are also the early orientations. So you're talking about 20th century, and this is how community organization was actually understood, and these were the aspects that formed the basis of community organization. Now after Murray Ross, and this was from the 1950s, around the 1950s, in the 1960s, Jack Rothman's work on models of community organization received wide acceptance. In 2007, Rothman modified his models to address the changing patterns of community in society and of community work, and his models are now known as planning and policy, community capacity development and social advocacy. These were essentially drawn from the mixing of the 3 discrete models that he had developed in the 1960s. Weil and Gamble built on the models developed by Rothman to conceptualize the 8 model framework for guiding community practitioners in the field. The 8 models are neighborhood and community organizing, organizing functional communities, political and social action, community social and economic development, social planning, program development and community liaison, coalitions and social movements. These models kept in view the 3 critical lenses that are considered as relevant in the 21st century. This was in the work of Murray, Weil and Gamble, and these were the lenses that they highlighted through the model framework. The lenses are the first, multicultural context, the second, the feminist and human rights context, and the third, globalization. We'll discuss each of these a bit more. So with regard to the multicultural context, the authors, the scholars found that it signifies blurring boundaries across the world, and communication and commerce have eliminated the constraint of boundaries. There is a constant inflow and outflow of peoples across countries, across continents, and of course within country contexts. There is a dominance of multinational corporations. The vulnerabilities of the poor from various ethnic backgrounds have come to the fore and have perhaps been highlighted in the past few recent years. Community interventions, therefore, must address the needs of a heterogeneous and multicultural population. Now, if one understands the context of multiculturalism for community practice, then the implications for the practitioner are that they must be able to understand such a context, to be able to connect to diverse populations, different sections of people, different types of people, understand culture, understand the practices, the thinking of various communities, and be able to work with them. And such work with communities is perhaps possible only when there is a certain level of acceptance, not only tolerance, but acceptance of the diversity, the differences, and the history of these communities. So multiculturalism as a context for community practice has far-reaching implications, which has far-reaching implications for the practitioners and for communities as well. The second lens of the feminist and human rights context is extremely significant, because we see in recent times that women are recognized as major contributors to community practice and to macro interventions, and that feminism as an approach, the feminist perspective, is now a universal feature of all the existing models and practice, and the base of the value base of practice as well. So a feminist perspective in the sense of talking about ending domination or doing away with domination, with oppression and with exploitation and exploitative practices among and across communities. And therefore, as a perspective, feminism goes beyond the issues of women and tries to understand various types of power equations that need to be worked with. Human rights is extremely critical to community practice, and in fact now informs much of the agenda as well as the approach of work that practitioners do with communities. The context of globalization is multidimensional. Globalization is understood also in literature in different ways. Now, as a phenomenon, for community practice, we will look at it as a phenomenon that has economic, social, and cultural ramifications and implications, and influences the lives of individuals, communities, large sections of populations in various ways. The second dimension here would be that the emergence of multinational corporations has actually greatly influenced and affected people's interests and their lives, and the predominance also of market and of the corporate agendas has influenced, has actually affected the everyday lives and the goals and aspirations of people. Skewed power dynamics often lead to social and economic disparities, and you find in countries such as India and others that the vulnerabilities of populations, of communities, are actually increasing. Newer and newer communities and sections of population are now becoming vulnerable. And when we say vulnerable, we are particularly referring to the ability of certain households and communities to withstand any kind of shock or any kind of setback or such an event. So an illness or a death in the family, the inability of a person to go to work, to contribute to the financial situation of the family, of the household. Now all of these actually get have a bearing on the vulnerability of the household. And so with loss of livelihoods, large scale unemployment and dispossession from lands, resources for various communities, you find that more and more communities and sections of population are becoming vulnerable. And among the ones who were already in conditions of poverty, the vulnerabilities are also getting enhanced. So with a crunch of resources and financial constraints, people are forced to take children out of school or to make compromises and adjustments with regard to education and health within the household. So this is a dynamic that is now unfolding, and it has been unfolding for some time, but it's a dynamic that is now very evident and stares in the face of community workers. To give you a very simple example, in the city of Mumbai, when with the closure of certain industries and large scale unemployment that increased in the past couple of decades, we found that in the course of interactions with residents of various geographic settlements and these communities, that more and more women were now seeking jobs. And they wanted to come into the job market because the income of the household was simply not sufficient to make ends meet and for the family to survive and meet its needs. So women have entered the job market and are job seekers now in order to cope with the financial constraints and exigencies. The other aspect, therefore, then you see that communities are facing problems like loss of livelihood, low wages, health issues, and dying traditional art forms. There's a lack of labor rights. Overall, there are several constraints that various communities are having to deal with, and I'm sure that you would be able to connect this with sections of population and communities that you are actually working with, because say art forms that were relevant some decades ago, that were the source of survival and livelihood and meaning for the lives of many communities, are now dying out and they are now irrelevant. Now various factors may have contributed to this, such as increasing urbanization or the financial unviability of those very art forms within the rural context. So a number of reasons have led to setbacks for various communities. So the character of communities and their conditions has undergone a change within this context of globalization. Now, just to connect this discussion on earlier discussions with the values and the purpose of community practice, I think that in various country contexts, social workers are guided by code of ethics that they follow, and yet there is a broad consensus about the values that we all believe in and must demonstrate through our practice. Values of service, of social justice, dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationships, integrity and competence. I mean, I think these are the bedrock of all of practice and community work and work with people. Now, the major part of a community practitioner's work is to accommodate divergent strategies and ideologies to find a common ground for collective action. So in given situations, in given contexts where we work, you would try to find strategies and develop appropriate strategies and approach to address issues for the people and with them. So clearly with an alignment with the interests of the marginalized populations, one would seek to find ways to address their issues. So there is actually, it must be stated, that there is actually no ideal type of purpose or goal or ideal strategies, but they will present themselves in mixed ways, they will emerge. There is a clear background and knowledge base that we have through models of community practice developed by various scholars, but there is definitely an element of dynamism in the way they unfold in various situations. So let us come now to the 8 models of community practice developed by these scholars. This is a very comprehensive work on model development. It builds on the earlier work of Jack Rothman, and in fact you will find that there are strains of locality development, social planning and social action in the 8 model framework that is provided here and discussed here. What I will do is I will talk about each of the models and introduce them to you briefly. You will find the details discussed in the e-text and in the readings that are given with the e-text. The 8 model framework discusses the major tenets which guide community practice in the 21st century. So as a more recent piece of work, recent body of work, it's relevant because it also tries to incorporate examples from across various country contexts. These models have been categorized based on the outcomes, change targets, the constituencies, the scope of the concern, and the role of the social worker. The first of the models is neighborhood and community organizing. Now, community practice at a fixed geographical location often engages community members who live in proximity and face similar issues. So this is basically a very conventional and clear understanding of what community organization has been seen as. So the neighborhood as the basis for similarity of concerns of people and for their coming together. Now the model aims at building agency of people, at developing leadership, at planning and organizing skills of the community members. So in that sense, it does draw on some of the tenets of locality development. Community takes collective action to pressure public officials or authorities for the desired outcome. That is the way the community would work, and that's the goal that it would have. So there's an interface with authorities concerned to work towards desired outcomes of the community. So much of the community initiatives through community-based organizations, what we in India understand as CBOs, for example, much of this would fall within the scope of neighborhood and community organizing. So self-help groups, cooperative societies, the cooperative institutions, local community, youth groups, women's groups, all of these which may be interacting to enhance their own abilities, their own capacities, improve their own life situation, and also interfacing with, say, municipal authorities or local village authorities in order to achieve certain outcomes for the area, for the geographic community. These are the kind of interventions that we would understand within the scope of neighborhood and community organizing. The second model talks about organizing functional communities. So as discussed in an earlier module, there are different kinds of communities that we work with, and those that go beyond the geographic understanding of community are functional communities. So the technology explosion has made the working of organizing and coming together functional communities much easier, and you therefore have people coming together across countries, within the country, across different geographic spaces, coming together because they align with some particular issue or interest. And such a community and a sense of community that is fostered through communication, through technology, which is able to transcend geographic boundaries, is basically a functional community. So common interest, common goals, and common agenda that they are working towards, and the capacity and ability to communicate. These are key features of such kind of communities. So with the LGBTQ community, you find, there is mobilizing, organizing across continents, within the country, across different states. People will come together and they will be advocating for LGBTQ rights, is one example of the functional community. And so identity-based organizations across the world with common interests and concerns, they can easily connect with each other and engage with each other to address their needs and the issues that their members are facing. So there are several, for example, worker organizations. So people engaged in similar type of work in various countries may also form, may also be able to come together to carve out a common agenda, common goals, and then to engage in advocacy on those common issues as functional communities. The third model is community, social and economic development, and the poverty reduction strategies form a central theme in most community intervention programs. So this model is talking about the fact that you work towards social and economic development of the communities, and therefore this would be aimed at environmental, sustainable development, human development, and with a social and an economic agenda. Now these goals will contribute to more comprehensive development of the community. So typically you find institutions in the community that bring about social change, that also bring about some social transformation, alter relationships between people, and at the same time work with a certain economic agenda for the community. These are the kind of organizations and initiatives that we would understand within the framework of community, social and economic development. Social planning again draws on the earlier understanding. We can draw on the earlier understanding from Rothman's models. Social planning is marked by heavy reliance on conceptual tools and technical rational planning, where you're making assessments, identifying needs and resources and so on, and then working to address issues through this kind of planning. It is generally led by experts, and in recent years community participation has become the cornerstone of social planning approach. So typically any kind of initiative or program, any kind of program, development program, whether it is in health, it's in education, or it's for planning for a particular community, will talk about participation of the community. So one of the key features of social planning in the current context is the fact that community participation is more actively inserted as an agenda and as a goal into this kind of practice. Program development and community liaison talks about total community participation in all stages of the program. It starts with needs assessment, followed by developing appropriate interventions to address these needs. So the practitioner here for this direction of work, the practitioners would be located or could be located with voluntary organizations or with government departments, but in the course of their work and engagement with communities, when newer needs arise, when newer ideas emerge for that need to be implemented, then the community workers these social workers with these organizations would then engage in advocacy for initiating those new programs for the community. So it's basically linking up the organization, that's the voluntary organization or the government department, with the community, and trying to do it effectively by responding to newer emerging needs that come up through developing effective programs and newer programs as and when they are required. The model on political and social action is essentially about the partnership of the community practitioner with community members to overturn an oppressive and discriminatory social and political order and institutions at local, national or international levels. So the social worker, community worker, working with community members to deal with these issues and systems of oppression. And the communities would collectively participate and challenge the existing regressive institutions. So such initiatives may be largely political and social in nature. So you have certain kinds of political formations, or you may have non-party political formations which clearly have an agenda to challenge power equations or particular type of institutions and practices at the local, national or larger levels. So it's a collective action in partnership with the community worker with a clear political agenda and aimed at bringing about certain kind of social change as well. So perhaps certain political parties which represent the interests of marginalized sections of population, they could be examples of such initiatives. Some other political formations which may be initiated at local levels could also be an illustration of political and social action. The model on coalitions talks about the coming together of groups which have common issues or concerns. So, which is essentially what a coalition is. So in coalitions, the practitioner essentially assumes the role of the leader, the spokesperson, a facilitator or a mediator. And coalitions are often a precursor to a social movement. So it may start as a coalition and then evolve into a social movement. But examples of coalitions could be different environmental groups or trade union federations which basically bring together organizations, formal or not formal, and in that sense I mean that, you know, registered, unregistered. So they could be formations or they could be actual organizations, but collectives of all of such organizations which have common issues or concerns. For example, in the Indian context, you have coalitions of organizations working with informal workers. So informal workers in various sectors, in various industries, represented by different groups and organizations, and a coalition of all of these which seeks to address their issues, take up the issues of concern and to support these organizations in their struggles is an example of coalition-based work. The eighth model is about social movements, which social movements take place when a large section of the society reacts to existing social or environmental concerns by striving for a new paradigm to change these conditions. So it's essentially questioning, contesting and resisting existing systems, institutions or policies. And social movements can also be organized with engagement engagement of coalitions from across the world. So the scope of a social movement would depend on, I mean, it could be large, it could be local, it could be national, it could also be beyond the national boundaries. And for example, the anti-globalization movement has brought together various groups such as human rights activists, the feminists, and child protection activists, labor rights activists, and so on. So movements on a broad scale where sections of society are reacting to existing situation, social order or practices is one example of community organization. So this 8 model framework presents an interwoven understanding of the 3 critical lenses across various situations for community work, and a fairly comprehensive view of community organization and community practice, and it promotes the basic values of community organization, which is to build a world full of compassion, equal participation and social justice. So in this module we have discussed the 3 lenses that are influencing community practice in present day times. They lay the context for community practice, and then we moved on to discussing the 8 model framework developed by Weil and Gamble. This is one of the recent bodies of work and has a bearing on much of community practice that we are engaged in various parts of the world. The significance of this model framework is that it allows for multiple variations in practice to actually be represented in the framework. So within social action, there are different models that are detailed. With social planning and locality development, again, there are more variations in practice that actually allowed for in the way the model framework is explicated. As in the case of other models, this kind of a framework can be relevant to understand various aspects of community work, and to also conceptualize community work more effectively along the lines of the parameters that are detailed. So, for example, the goals of community work, the role of the practitioner, all of these, the strategies, all of these are really clearly explicated. It can help students of community work and practitioners to actually, understand and analyze their own work along the lines of these parameters. For details on these for details on this topic and the model framework, you can refer to the e-text and to the attached readings. Thank you.